Hello and welcome back to another episode of Coding with Unity. In this video, we'll be updating our inventory system to look more like this one. We'll also be updating our items so that they'll have random item buffs on them that can have different stats and random values between a minimum and maximum value. And each time you pick up a copy of the same item, it will have a different random value on that item based off what buffs you give it. We'll also be updating the inventory system to allow for stackable and non-stackable items so that each time you pick up the same type of sword, it'll have a different value on it because of the random stats, and it won't stack it, so it'll be separate and you'll be able to look at the values separately within your inventory. So to get started, let's open up our item object script that we were working on in the previous videos. Now inside of here, let's make a few changes. Instead of a public game object prefab, we don't really need it to be a whole game object. All we need is the sprite that's going to be displayed for this object. So let's make it say public sprite, and instead of a prefab, we'll call it a UI display because it's what'll be used to display it in its 2D form. Now we're going to make a change to the way the item database works also. We're going to be setting the item's ID during the serialization of the database object so that it just makes it a little easier on us and cleans our code up a bit. So inside of our item object, we can say public int or public integer, and we'll call it ID with a capital I. Now we can go back into Unity and let this compile. And we're probably going to get a few errors because of the things that we changed, so we can just go ahead and fix those errors really quick. So instead of prefab, this needs to say we're going to actually have to make another variable inside of our display inventory class, and we're going to call it public game object, and we're going to call it inventory prefab because we're going to have one single prefab that every single item in our inventory uses, and the only thing we will change on it is the sprite of that prefab. So now instead of instantiating the prefab that was on the item, we'll just instantiate the actual inventory prefab that we just created. Now we need to access the image of the inventory prefab so that we can change the sprite display to the sprite display of the item that it should be displaying. So we'll say object.transform.getChild, and we're going to use it as the 0th child. You could also use getComponentInChildImage. But when we create the prefab, you'll see why we're doing it this way. Then we'll say getComponentInChild, and the component we want is an image. You have to import the using Unity engine.ui for this to work. Then we'll say .sprite. But to be able to finish the rest of this line, we're going to need to make changes in other parts of our code first. So let's go into our inventory object and let's make some changes here. So we already made the database public. And the reason we did that is because we're not going to be setting it with this anymore. We can actually just go ahead and delete the entire onEnable function that we created previously. Now one major change we're going to be making is instead of just holding the container on our inventory object, we're going to move this to its own class so that we can pull just the data we need from the inventory slots instead of everything that's on the inventory object. So to do that, let's scroll down to the bottom of here, above the inventory slot or below it, your choice, just as long as you're outside one of the other classes. We'll say system.serializable, and then we'll say public, class, inventory. Then inside of here, the only thing that it's going to have is this list that we used to have on the inventory object. And instead of container, we'll call it items. Now let's scroll back up to our inventory object. And we're going to add in the inventory that we just created. So we'll say public inventory, and we'll call it container. Now let's go back into the display inventory. And for now, let's just line out this entire script so we don't get the errors from it. And we'll come back and fix this in a few minutes. Go back into Unity and let's let it compile and find where the rest of our errors are at. Let's line this error out. We'll fix that in a bit also. So apparently we don't have any errors. So let's go back into our inventory object. Now since we have our item saving on its own class called inventory, we can actually use just an iFormatter to save the file and load the file instead of using the JSON utility. But this is really more of your choice to do because using the JSON utility allows for players to be able to edit the file themselves so they can make changes based off how they want to play the game. which in my opinion, if it's a single player game and they purchased it, or if it's free, I think it's their prerogative to be able to change whatever values they want because it's their experience and it's their game to play. But if you choose to want it to not be as easily as edible, we can use an iFormatter. And to do that, we can line this out and we'll say iFormatter, which means we'll need to use the system.runtime.serialization. We'll call it formatter, and it'll be a new binary formatter. Then we can say stream equals new file stream. Now we can have the same path that we had before. So we'll say stream.concact so we can combine multiple strings together. Then we'll use file mode.create and file access.write. Then we'll say formatter.serialize. We'll use the stream that we just created for the serialization. And what we want to serialize is the container. After we do that, we'll close the stream so we don't have any memory leaks. And excellent, we have our save function done. One other thing we can do is if we go above the function, we can type context menu. And we can give it a name, let's say save. And now if we go back into our Unity editor, go to the inventory object, and you can click the cogwheel and click on save. But I'm not going to save it right now because it's not fully working. So let's change our load system to use the iFormatter also. So we can line this out, and we'll say iFormatter. Formatter equals new binary formatter. Then stream equals new file stream. Then we can put the path in again. Now this time we'll say file mode.open and file access.read. Then we'll access the container on this file and we'll say container is equal to inventory because we're casting it to an inventory. And we'll say formatter.deserialize stream. Now we also need to close out of the stream again to make sure we don't get any memory leaks. Now we can add another function for clearing the inventory, so we'll say public void clear, and all it's going to do is say container is equal to new inventory. We can add the context menus to both of these functions. We'll call this one load and this one clear. Now when you click either of the three buttons inside of your Unity editor, it'll call either of those three functions. So we have our save, load, and clear. We can also get rid of the on before and on after deserialization from the inventory object, which means we can also remove this. Now the next thing we're going to change is our inventory slot is going to hold items and not item objects, which means we need to change the name of this class because this item class is representative of the items that are on the ground. And not only is that really a bad name for that class, we need to use it for another class. So we're going to change this class to be called ground item because that is what this class is a ground item. So we'll say ground item, and we can go to where this class is at inside of our project. Rename this to ground item. Now find where this error is, change this to say ground item. Now we have this renamed to ground item, which gives us the ability to create a new item class for a different use. So let's go back into our scripts. Let's go back into the item object class and let's create our item class inside of here. So first we'll say system.serializable, so it's visible within the editor. Then we'll say public class, item. Then on the item, we need a name, so we'll say public string, name. We need an ID, so public int ID. And then let's make a constructor for creating the item. When you create the item, you'll pass in an item object because that'll be the object we're pulling the values that the item should have from. So we'll say item object item. Then we can say name is equal to item.name. Then ID is equal to item.id. Then let's go back into our inventory object, change item object to say item. Let's save and compile and find what errors we have. The first error is inside the inventory slot, so let's change item object to say item. Compile again, find your next error, click on it. It's in the add item class in our inventory object, and we need to change this item object to be just an item. Then right here we can just say underscore item.id, check for more errors. Inside your player class where it says inventory.addItem, item.item, let's change that to saying new item, item.item. Find your next error. And there isn't one. So now if we go to our inventory object, you can see if we create 5 items. These are now classes of items instead of item objects, which makes it easier for saving and also allows us to add different values to the same item, meaning we can make multiple copies of the same item without it causing any weird errors with scriptable objects. Now let's go back into our item database object script, and we're going to make a couple changes in here. So we can completely get rid of the getID dictionary, and that means we can get rid of this and this. And now let's go inside of here, we'll say item i.id is equal to I. So your item's ID will always be set during serialization. And another thing we can do is we can take this getItem equals new dictionary and we can actually put it inside of on before serialize. So before it serializes, it clears the items out, and then after it's done serializing, it sets the item IDs. It's just to make it a little more performant. It's not necessary, so do it at your own choice, but I suggest it. Let's go back into Unity, let it compile, and we can test out our clear button by going to here and clicking clear. Now we need to set up all the sprites for our items, and I'm just going to drag in a sprite sheet that I have. The sprite sheet will be available in the description below, along with all the source code and files for this project. So I added 2 new graphics. I added the inventory background object, and I added a bunch of icons for all the different inventory objects that we'll be able to use. So the first thing I'll do, I'll click on my UI display, which is the inventory screen, go to 2D, and we're just going to change the background to the image I just added in. And we'll change the alpha to be full. Just looks a little better than the square we were using before. Now let's go back to our items and let's pick a bone sprite for our bones object. Now let's pick some type of fish for our monkfish. We need a shield for our shield. Now we need 3 different swords. Excellent, so we have all the sprites set up on all of our items. Let's go back into our script file and go into the display inventory scripts and fix the things that need to be fixed. So unline everything. Now let's say container.items.count. Same here. And in all the other spots that it needs to be done at. Then back where we were setting up the sprite for the image, we can say inventory.database.getItem. Now one thing to clean this code up a little bit is we can create a new variable inside of our for loop, and we'll call it inventory slot equals inventory dot container dot items I. So we can go through and replace a lot of these things to just say slot. So right here, just go through and change all of your inventory dot container dot items I to just say slot. So right here we can say get item slot dot item dot id dot UI display. Then going down here, let's do the same thing. We need to instantiate a prefab. So we can just copy and paste this to here. We can copy and paste this one in. We can replace this with slot and replace this with slot. Take this and just add it in right here. Then we can change this to also say slot. Excellent, we have our display inventory fixed now. Now inside of the player we can unline this and we'll say container.items.clear. Now we can go back into Unity, let it compile, and make sure we have no errors. Excellent, we do not. So let's see if the game works and we can still pick up items or not. We got an unassigned reference exception. It's because we have not created the new inventory prefab that we're going to be using. So let's just go to our canvas and change it to 2D. Let's create a new, on our inventory screen, go to right click UI, image, and this image will be a UI sprite. And let's change the color to like a slightly brown color, maybe about like that. We can change our width to 50 by 50. Now let's change this name to say inventory prefab. And then underneath this, let's create another UI image. Make this one 50 by 50. And then this image will hold the actual icon of the item that's being displayed. So you can see I selected the bones, so it's the bones being displayed. But if we selected any other object, it would be that one. So if we use this axe, then it would be an axe being displayed. So now let's add the text for how many of that item is going to be displayed. So go to UI, text mesh pro, zoom in a bit. We're going to make this the about the size of the bottom right hand corner. I'm going to make my color yellow. You can make yours whatever you want. Then I'm going to auto size it. Change this to a 1. Position it to always be on the right bottom or right center. Now that we have our inventory prefab created, we can drag and drop it into our prefabs folder and delete all of these image variants that we created in the previous video, because we'll just be using this one. Now let's position it where we think it looks good for the first item to be spawned in your inventory at. So we'll do -84 and 162. Which means let's go to our inventory screen and we'll make the X start -84 and the Y start 162. We can delete our prefab, click on play, and see if we forgot anything else. So let's move our player into an item. We still didn't set something up, which I believe is the same thing we didn't set up before, which is the inventory prefab of display inventory. So go back to your inventory screen where your display inventory script is and drag and drop your prefab. And let's try it one more time. Excellent, we picked up a bone, picked up another bone, a fish. Cool, we're picking up items. We just need to make them stackable because they aren't stacking anymore. And we need to separate them further out because they are stacking, just not in the way we want them to. Say 55 on the X space and Y space. That looks pretty perfect to me. Now we just need to figure out why our items aren't stacking. So if we go into our inventory object script where it says containers.items.item, we're going to say item.id is equal to item.id. We'll save that and we'll go back into our project, let it compile, and see if that fixes our problem. Excellent, you can see our bones are now stacking correctly. So we have our items converted to an item class, which stores on our player inventory as item classes, which we can then save out using the iFormatter and the binary formatter to a file that looks like this. So if we click enter, what causes it to save, then we can go into our area where it saves the file at. Or no, it's space that saves. So you click space and it saves. Then we can open up our save file and you can see it's now formatted in a way that's not editable by the player. But if you wanted it to be editable by the player, you can go back to using the JSON utility instead. But now that we have all of this done, we can go ahead and start adding item buffs to our items so that each copy of the same item can have different values on it. So to do that, let's go back into our scripts. Let's go into the item object class and let's create the different type of attributes that our game's going to have. So we're going to use an enumerator for that. So say public enum. We'll call it attributes. And then inside of here, we'll have agility, intellect, stamina, and strength. Now let's make a class for holding the item buffs. So we'll say public class item buff. And on here, it's going to have a public attribute. And that's the attribute that this item buff is going to be affecting. Then we'll have a public int value, which is the value that the current version of that item holds. Then we'll have a public int min and max for the minimum and maximum value that it can roll. Now let's create a constructor for when we create the item buff. So we'll say public item buff, int underscore min, int underscore max. Then we'll say min is equal to underscore min, and max is equal to underscore max. Now let's create another function and we're going to call it generate field, and every time this function is called, it'll regenerate the value to a new value between the minimum and maximum values. So we'll say generate field, or you could call it generate values. I guess that would make more sense. Generate value. And then we'll say value is equal to Unity engine dot random dot range min max. And the reason I said Unity engine.random is because in case you're using system and not system.collections or something like that, you'll have a error between using the system.random and the Unity engine.random. So it's just a habit for me to add that. It's not necessary unless you're using system. So we can go ahead and save our item buff class. Now our item object needs to hold these item buffs so that we can create the buffs that we want on our item object, scriptable object, inside of our editor. So we'll just say public item buff, and we'll make it an array by putting 2 brackets on the end of it. and we'll call it buffs. So we'll have an array of buffs on each item. Now let's create a function inside of here in case we want to create an item using a function on the object. It's just optional. You don't have to do this. It's just if at some point down the line it's easier to create an item this way, you'll already have it available to use. So we'll say item equal item new item is equal to new item, and then we'll pass in this. Then let's return new item. Now let's also create an array of item buffs on our item class. Now when a new item is created, we're going to have to copy the buffs over from the item object to our item class. The way we'll do that is by saying buffs equals new item buff, and the length of it will be item.buffs.length. You might think that you can just say buffs is equal to item.buffs right here, but arrays are references, so you'll always be referencing the array that's on the item object and not the array that's on the item class, which means when you go to edit the buffs or make any changes to them, so if you're regenerating the value to get a higher value on that item, it's going to actually reset the item object scriptable objects value instead of the item class value. So that's why we're saying buffs is equal to new item buff instead of just buffs is equal to item.buffs. So now we need to make a for loop through the item.buffs. You can also say buffs.length because we just set the length of it, so either one is fine. Then we'll say buffs I is equal to new item buff, item.buffsi.min, item.buffsi.max. So now every time we create the new class of an item, it'll make sure it has all of the item buffs on that item. And then we can go into the constructor for our item buff and just make it run generate value at the end of the constructor, so that as soon as the constructor for the item runs and it creates the item buffs, it'll go ahead and generate the random value for that buff. Now let's go back into the editor and see what this looks like inside of Unity. So go to your items, we'll pick shield, and the reason it's not showing up is if you go back into your scripts, our item buff is not serializable, so Unity doesn't know to display it, so we'll just add system.serializable, go back into Unity, and you'll see it should be displayed now. Excellent. Now one thing we can do is get rid of this attack bonus and defense bonus and all the other values that are on the items. So we have an equipment object, a food object, a default object, and an item object. We don't really need the default, the equipment, and the food. I'm going to leave it for now just so we don't have to recreate the item objects, and maybe sometime down the line we'll need them, but I don't think we do. I think we'll just be using the item object, but I'm going to leave it for now because we may change our mind. I'm just going to remove these random floats that we have on each of them instead. Alright, now if we go back to our items, we look at the bones. It has a list of buffs that you could set up on it if you want to, but you probably wouldn't. So since we haven't changed the default object and stuff, you could actually go into here and go to your base item object and only put the list of item buffs on the type of items that you want to have buffs, but I'll leave it like this for now. So we can go to our shield and you can see we have a list of buffs. Let's give it 2 buffs. And if you alt click these drop down arrows, it'll automatically expand all of the things below it. And if you close it while also holding alt, it'll close everything. So we'll have 2 buffs. We'll do one for agility and one for strength. This one would be a value between 5 and 12. This one 4 and 20. Let's give buff values to the other items also that we want to have buffs. So our swords, we'll just do it all 3 at the same time. We'll give them all 1 buff. The sword can have sword 0 or just sword. We'll have agility between 10 and 20. Sword 1, we'll give it stamina between 1 and 20. And sword 2, we'll give it strength between 5 and 50. So let's see what happens when we try to pick up items. We didn't get any errors. If we go to our inventory, click on the player inventory, we can look at the shield. We have 2 buffs on it, an agility buff. Our values are between 5 and 12, and we rolled an 11. That's almost a perfect shield on that value. And then we have 4 and 20 and rolled a 13. But both of them are saying attribute agility, and if we go to our shield, it's supposed to be agility and strength. So let's see what we're messed up on. It should be in where it copies from the item object to the item. So somewhere in here, we just need to say buffsi.attribute is equal to item.buffsi.attribute. Go back into Unity and let it compile. Click play. Now let's pick up the items and see if it's working. Now we're getting an error. It's saying it's not set to the instance of an object. I think that's because we have to do it after we create the new item buff. Then we can actually simplify this by doing that. Go back into here, click play, and it should work. Alright, we picked up all our items. Let's go into our inventory and see if everything seems right. So agility and strength, but 8, which is between the value, 7, which is between the values. Excellent. Everything seems to be working just fine. Cool. Excellent. Now if we click space, it should save our inventory out. We can close out of the game, reopen it. Click enter, and it reloads our inventory. Excellent. Now we need to make the items that have item buffs on them not stackable. The way we're going to do this is by going into our item object class, actually the inventory object class, and for now we're not going to make a variable for if it's stackable or not. We're just going to check and see if the item has buffs on it, and if it does have buffs, we're just going to create a new item instead of adding it to the amount of that item. So we'll say if _item.buffs.length is greater than 0. We'll say container. We can actually just copy and paste this. And then we'll say return, so it won't do any of the following code. So if the item has a buff, it'll add it to the container and return. If it doesn't have a buff, it'll just follow the original code that we were running. Let's go back into the game and see if that works. That's just a real simple way of doing it. Really, it'd be better to probably put a stackable or not stackable button on your items, which we'll probably do down the line. So let's pick up some items. Let's save the inventory. Let's close, reopen, load our inventory, and pick up some more items. And you can see all the items that we added that have item buffs are not stacking, and it's creating new versions of that item instead, and the ones without buffs are stacking. We can go to our player inventory and just check to make sure that the random values are working correctly. So let's see, we have a shield, and it's got agility of 10, strength of 8. Let's look for another shield. And this shield has a strength of 19 and agility of 8. So we can confirm by that it's not using the same values of the previous shield, and it is creating a new shield with its own values. So excellent, everything seems to be working. The only thing we didn't do in this video is add in the Unity's character controller and make it to where you can actually walk around like it was in the previous video. But I don't think I'm going to add that in this video. And I also didn't show how I added these items in, which don't think I'll show either because this video is already getting pretty long. I'll make the next video will be the updating the graphics of the system and showing how I do the items facing the screen. Because if you notice, they're not facing your camera, and then when you click play, they do automatically start facing the camera. And then another thing that I have on them is if you click on an item and you just change the type of item, it automatically changes what it displays on the ground. So in the next video, I'll show how to do those things. And then after that, we'll move on to actually creating an equipment system to where when you wear or remove an item, it'll actually add those stats to your character and remove those stats from your character. But I think this is a good stopping point for this video. If you learned anything or enjoyed the video or have any feedback or suggestions, leave a comment below. If you're looking forward to the next video or you just enjoyed the series that I'm doing, feel free to give a like and a subscribe to the channel. If not, you know what to do. And have a wonderful day, and until next time, keep coding.